Welcome to the Asking Why podcast. I'm your host, Clint Davis, and today we have the summer special extra episode with Cole Westoff. Cole is a counselor here. He's an LPC, trained in addiction and trauma, and he's been with us for a little over 2 years now.
Just over.
Yep, a little over 2 years. He's in our Bossier office, and he bounces back in our Shreveport office too. Cole's one of the best counselors we have on staff that's a male, and has just done some amazing work. And when he first came over, we knew he was sadly going to be leaving us in a couple of years because of his wife getting an awesome opportunity and job. So we knew we had this time together. And so he's about to be heading out this summer, and he's going to be working for us online where he's moving. And I'll let him tell you about that. But Cole, welcome. Glad to have you, man.
Hey, glad to be here. We've talked about it for a little while, and getting it set up feels kind of good.
Yeah, it's going to be great. So tell us about kind of your credentials, what brought you to CDC, and what made you a therapist. Tell us your story.
Sure. So let's see. What brought me to CDC and my credentials? So I do have a master's in mental health counseling. I have a bachelor's in psychology and interpersonal communications. I double majored. Thankfully, my wife's better at organizing and figuring those things out than I was. So I am the oddball that went to undergraduate and said, I know exactly what I want to be. I like working with people. I like helping people with their problems. I'm going to come in and do therapy. Now, let's see how to make that happen. And so I thought, what better to help me as a therapist than to understand how do people think and what happens if it gets messed up? And how do people communicate and what happens when it gets messed up? And so I double majored in that and then went on to finish my program at Missouri State University in mental health counseling.
Yeah.
Because I figured at that point that's what I wanted to do. And so I am in LPC. I got my license in Missouri. That's where I'm from. And ported that on down here when my wife got a job down here in Louisiana. She's a resident. And we are finishing that up, and we'll be heading back to the Springfield, Missouri area, where I plan to continue as an LPC. I do have some credentialing in EMDR, and I have so this is where it gets kind of awkward when people ask me this question. They're like, well, you look rather young. How many years of experience do you have? And I go, almost 10. I'm like, okay, that's a little more than I thought. And I go, but if you're working with me and you're talking about things like substance use and addictions, which is an area where I would say, it feels weird to say it, but I think there's a definition I heard one time that an expert is someone who's worked in a field for 5 to 10 years. And I go, well, technically.
Or 100,000 hours or something like that. Yeah.
Something like that. I go, well, technically, I've studied substance use and addiction since I was 11 years old. So at this point in my life, having just turned 31, I've been studying this for 20 years or working in the field for 20 years. And so I go, well, that's kind of my credentials there on that.
Yeah, so what at 11 did you start thinking about substance abuse and addiction? How'd that happen?
Yeah, so that's the big
typical
story.
11-year-old.
No, it's not. That's the big story that definitely pulled me into being a therapist, too, is we had a family tragedy when I was about 10 or 11 years old. I had a very close cousin of mine who was like an older brother to me in a lot of regards, who was killed in a drunk driving accident. And it was really devastating on the family. And I developed almost what I would call an overshot reaction to his death. In that I went into it going, any and all substances are the worst things that exist on this planet. Hardcore trauma response.
Yep.
And using them or even considering using them is one of the worst decisions you could ever make.
Yeah.
That's where I started. And so, I went to a grief camp because thankfully I grew up in a family that had the resources and the wherewithal to try to help us to mitigate some of that trauma.
Now, were you in church at the time? Like, is your family believers? Like, how did that play into it?
Yeah, so I grew up Roman Catholic, and we were kind of we showed up on Sundays, and that was the kind of the largest extent of it, is we were involved, and I would say casually. We did what we kind of felt was what you were supposed to do.
Do you think that played into the kind of the Catholicism maybe the heavy kind of right and wrong, black and white version of like sin and sins that I can't remember what they're called, but mortal sins and what's the other one? You're the Catholic.
Oh, it's been a long time.
Yeah. But you know what I mean, like venial and man, I can't think of the other one. Chip, do you know? No help. No help from the producer. Anyway, so the point being, if you're Catholic, sorry, we're totally butchering your theology here. But some Catholics believe, in real heavy sins that are unforgivable and some are not. And, there tends to be a lot heavy focus on behavior and, Catholic school and all of those things.
I remember my rosary. I kneeled on those benches. My niece still remember.
Yeah, not that there's not that same thing in the Protestant world. We all have skewed theology, not bashing on Catholics, but I do tend to see that when it comes to drugs and alcohol and sex, that unhealthy religions, both Protestant and Catholic, can have unhealthy like behavior modification. So I can imagine at 11, if you're growing up in the Catholic Church, going nominally, hearing kind of hellfire and brimstone to some degree, that then this happens, that there would be kind of a moral part of that also.
Yeah, I think that I could certainly see how those innervated as I was developing and figuring it out. I was, and I think this is where I've started working on grief more in my practice too, is understanding that more as I grow up, just how devastating and angry I was.
Yeah.
From a faith perspective, that is the one very clear picture in my mind where I can say this is one tragedy I experienced where I was mad at God.
Yeah.
And because it's one of those crystal clear memories you have. I remember crying in my bed, and then at some point I got down on my knees and I was just like, why? Why did this happen? How could this happen? Absolutely devastating. And, from there, we did this grief camp thing, which was helpful. And then I got a part of this program that was where I was growing up that focused on teaching adolescents leadership skills and education on substance use, what it does, how it works, taking it a little beyond scare tactics and really getting more into like the meat and bones of it and saying, this is what a drug is and this is how a drug works and this is what you're going to experience and this is what's going to happen if you keep doing it. And it was really helpful to get a sincere education on that instead of just, hey, if you do this, you're going to die.
Right. Fear factor.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
This is your brain's on drugs.
Yeah. Anybody that's studied psychology for very long, Psychology 101, punishment works to a point. What really works is education, understanding, and reinforcement of healthy and helpful decisions. And really taking that step further, I had such a passionate experience in that regard. I kept involved with that group for a really long time, to the point where I interned for their summer conferences, and I was a keynote speaker or a breakout session speaker at one point. I kept going to this thing from 11 or 12 to I think 21 or 22. Wow. So I did it for a decade. I was just really passionate about it, and it was a big part of my life. So
from that age to 21, did you ever like, high schoolers are drinking, people are smoking, people are doing these things. Were you just like still in that space of like, there's no way in?
I was a pretty hard no.
Yeah.
I think I can think of a handful of times in high school where I was like, okay, maybe I'll try a drink or two. For the most part, I just didn't do any of it. Right. Because I was really hard no. Yeah. And and this is why I say it's a trauma response, is there are times where I was like, I can look back and go, ooh, I kind of pushed some people away because I was very judgmental about their approach in my efforts to prevent them from experiencing the kind of pain and loss that I did.
Right, because that trauma response is like anybody who drinks is going to die, right? Yeah. Like it's what is that, Hell's Gates and Heaven's Gates and Hell's Fire or something, that like thing that people go through where they show up and it's like kids are lined up and they take them and they're like, if you have sex, you're going to have a drive and then you're going to die. If you get drive drunk, you're going to die. If you cuss, you're going to die. It's like this whole like walkthrough of those things that are terrifying.
Yeah, for sure.
And then at
And
the end, people are sitting there. Do you want to talk about Jesus?
I don't know if I want to talk to you ever.
Yeah.
But so I guess from there, I took some classes in psychology and sociology, and always found myself to be kind of like the friend that people came and talked to when I wasn't being judgy.
Mm-hmm.
And that led me on to kind of going into therapy and really trying to see things from other people's perspectives. And then early in my career, I worked at a small private practice where I worked exclusively with individuals coming out of state and federal prison.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was one of the biggest turning points for me professionally, to really get into an empathy mindset and out of a trauma responsive, judgmental mindset. Because the challenge there is that most people walk into those circumstances and meet someone with some of the backgrounds that I worked with, and they're like, you're the scariest person on earth. You know, you're what people are afraid of. And I would meet these people and go, you're just a person that made decisions.
Yeah.
And I have to see you that way. That's my profession. That's my job. And how healing and liberating that was to start seeing people not for any sins they'd committed or unhealthy choices they made or the trauma in their background, but seeing them as people.
Yeah.
And I think that was the best starting place I could have possibly had for that reason. Is it really taught me to see people for who they are, not just the decisions that they make.
Mm-hmm.
And that, you know, from a faith perspective, if we all are made in his image, that means we all have that spark of godliness in us, which means that if sin does dominate us in our life, we can also tap back into that.
Yeah.
It's just about making those choices, switching those perspectives and those lifestyles.
Yeah. It's good. I think, you know, a lot of people look at people's behavior and go, oh man, like I would never do that.
Mm-hmm.
Or they go, how could they? You know, and when you're naive and young,
Yeah.
you know, it was the same thing. It's funny, I haven't thought about this in forever, but I was a very much like no drinking, love dare, you know, all those kind of things. Drugs and alcohol were like, that's heavy sin stuff.
Yeah.
So I was just going to be the good little boy, not realizing that lust and anger and arrogance and, you know, all those things are also just as damaging. So yeah, it's, you know, you can, when you haven't gone through anything or when you haven't let that what you've gone through integrate into who you are and you're young, it's really easy to be judgmental and critical of people when you don't understand. I think as counselors, and you know could say this probably now, even from that point to here, right, getting to sit with people who are in pain, who make bad choices, who, you know, who internally and externally are not integrated and, you know, don't feel like they're the same person. It's like we get to hear their story.
Yeah.
You know, we get to sit and go, okay, well, yeah, you're drinking. Yeah, you're drugging. Yeah, you got a divorce. Yes, you're cheating. Yes, you abused this person. Now let's hear your story and how you got here.
Yeah.
And I think when Christians especially, and, you know, hopefully I step on your toes if you're listening to this, if you have this perspective of, oh my gosh, like clutching your pearls at everything that's sinful or cussing or violence or, you know, versus grieving that and then wondering how can I step into that and be, you know, help redeem that in somebody's life. Or if you could never see yourself doing something that bad, then it's, you know, probably not a great place to be because you might not have looked at yourself properly because we're all, but for the grace of God, capable of doing really horrible things.
Oh, yeah.
And so maybe it's not drinking and maybe it's not drugging and maybe it's not, you know, something else. But we've all got our stuff that we are off the rails with, whether we know it or not.
Yeah. And I think that's definitely the part that helps with humanizing and empathizing is just recognizing, hey, addiction is something else. It's not this penultimate sinful nature. It's a difficult thing that exists in our life, and we have to find ways to navigate it to get out of those habits, those patterns.
Well, let's define that. So what is, if you could give a cold definition of addiction, what would you say?
Yeah, disclaimer, this is a cold definition of addiction, and by no means is this associated with. No, what I would say, the functional definition of addiction that I work with is an addiction is a dysfunctional pattern of behaviors that causes us injury in one or more areas of our life and it impacts us physically, emotionally, and spiritually in some way. And so, hot take, if you will, I have heard the phrase a lot in my professional career. I was a functioning addict. And when you run with a definition of addiction that it is a dysfunction that is negatively impacting these multiple areas of your life, that becomes an oxymoron. You can't say I'm a functional dysfunction. I think for me, it's leaning more into the idea that even in my dysfunction, I can manage things. It's just like if you had an injury, say you broke your leg. It doesn't mean you're incapable of walking on your other leg. It does mean you're not walking normally. That's a dysfunctional state for you. It's not, I'm a functional walker.
Yeah.
It's, I'm a dysfunctional person at that point who is capable of still moving.
That's good. I like that.
And I think that gets more into a realistic standpoint when we're talking about addiction, because I think saying I'm a functioning addict, one thing that I've learned in my career is to kind of cut to the chase on some things. It's about being genuine in an authentic way, but not in a way that's going to ice over the issues. And I think with addiction, the reason I challenge functional addict is because it's a way to ice over the issue. It becomes that statement that says, I'm not that bad, see? Go back to that Christian perspective we were talking about. That's kind of like saying, well, so-and-so has these sins, but my sins aren't as bad as that because they're not this.
Right. What Jesus kind of blows out of the water when he says, if you are angry with your brother, it's the same thing as committing murder. If you look at a woman lustfully, it's the same thing as committing adultery.
Exactly.
Yeah. He's saying, no. We're all, morally, we're all destitute, and you need me.
Now, what I wouldn't say if someone has an addiction, it's going to look just like the other person, or that there's not levels of difficulty or severity, just like we all have struggles with different sins in our lives.
Yeah, so food's an easy one.
Yeah.
We had Ashley last week on the podcast, and we talked about food. So can you kind of lay out maybe, you could use alcohol. You can use whatever you want. I just think food's easy because lots of times it's that thing where when you think about addiction and you give those parameters and you go, okay, well, I am not happy with my weight. I have high cholesterol. I feel bad internally.
Yeah.
So I know I shouldn't eat at Cane's.
Right.
Not because the food is bad, Ashley, but because I know that, those things can impact my health in a negative way. And I've identified that as an area that does do that.
Yeah.
And yet, when I feel bad or happy or sad, or I'm tired or hungry or lonely, I tend to go to Cane's real quick and grab something. And maybe I just eat 3 fingers instead of the caniac.
Yeah.
But, and for my Southern people that listen to this, that you're missing out. And for my Christian friends, Chick-fil-A is better. Anyway, so, when we do that, it sometimes looks like it fits the criteria of addiction. And so it's like, do we call that addiction?
Right. And I think again, we're going back to that concept of it's dysfunctional and it's causing harm in these multiple areas of our life. From a
What level of harm?
Yeah. From a professional diagnostic standpoint, if I were to crack open the DSM-5 right now, there are, I think, 11 or 12, or I don't remember how many off the top of my head anymore.
Well, they keep changing.
Different substance use disorder diagnoses, and they all have the same 11 criteria. And that manual breaks it down into if you have 2 of these symptoms within a year's time consistently, you have a mild substance use disorder. If you have 4 of these symptoms or more until the point of 6, you have a moderate substance use disorder. And if you have 6 plus, you have a severe substance use disorder. And so, taking your example of food, it's am I going to Cane's and I get the caniac once a month, once a week, every day? Do I just dabble in a little bit of Cane's multiple days a week, but at least I'm not the caniac user?
That's right.
Because I'll tell you, I've worked in a lot of inpatient units, and I've heard those arguments, the things of like, well, I may use methamphetamine, but I'm not a heroin user.
Right.
Or, vice versa. And I think that's where stigma and a lot of the judgmentalness that comes with addiction, where it can get a little unique in that regard. But I think if we're looking at it from that approach, addiction does vary. I think the hard part is when people hear the word addiction or they hear the word addict. In my experience, what people are thinking of is they're thinking of that Hollywood special addict. They're thinking of a person that is destitute and smells like they haven't bathed in months, and they're homeless and they can't keep a job and they can't keep a single relationship, and their body's aching and covered in issues. And sometimes that's where addiction takes us, and that is the picture we present.
Yeah, or they picture the dad and the wife beater who's an alcoholic that comes in, that's late, that slaps
100%.
everybody around and abuses everybody, which happens and is a thing and a major problem.
Yeah, that's why I got additional training in EMDR and trauma-informed therapy, is because that isn't the last statistic I read is that I think it was something like 70% of people that meet the criteria for a substance use disorder could potentially meet the criteria for PTSD. I mean, that's an overwhelming majority in that regard.
Yeah, it's so crazy, man, when getting into like trauma therapy with people, how people act, like the research on PTSD, what you say that, okay, you gave that statistic, and then yet I was reading something the other day, and it was saying like 12, I was talking about PTSD, and it's like 12% of the in the entire population has PTSD, and I'm like, that's super low. You know what I mean? Like, that's insanely low.
Yeah.
It's so much higher than that, because I think people think PTSD is hard to get.
Yeah. Well, and I think, there you get into, we could do probably a whole nother podcast on the difference between what is trauma and what's PTSD.
Sure.
But yeah, I think there's just...
And how long is it lasting? Is it acute or chronic and all that? Yeah,
absolutely. And so I think in that regard, when you think of addiction, it is the least biased thing I can possibly think of this world. Addiction doesn't care what color your skin is. It doesn't care what religion you practice. It doesn't care if you're old or young, rich or poor. I've met people from every single walk of life with an addiction problem, because it's... from a faith perspective, it's a sin and a heart problem.
It does matter what you're addicted to.
Sure.
That's the interesting part too. Socioeconomically, it's like I say, like, there's not a lot of white upper class people smoking crack.
Yeah, not predominantly.
Right, like
that's not where that's associated for the most part.
Right.
You think of traditionally, you think of like the very wealthy, and you think of things like cocaine.
Exactly.
And you think of the lower socioeconomic status, and you think of things like cheap alcohol or methamphetamine or crack.
Yep.
And, to some degree, those statistics and that research is going to tell you, yeah, those are general trends. And, they're not wrong.
No, I mean, they're socioeconomic. Those things are cheaper to make.
Yeah.
There's less shame around certain things. Some of them are nicer and they're produced better. They're safer overall. Like you're not cooking it in a trailer somewhere. Like, I mean, there's all these things that go with it. You can get it out. You can produce it. You can mass produce it.
Oh yeah.
There's not a mafia involved or a trafficking section involved or some big cartel from Mexico.
Right.
But I think that's part of the problem with addiction, is that we moralize some drugs over others.
Oh yeah.
So can you talk about that a little bit?
All right.
Yeah.
Hot take number 2. I definitely agree with that. I think there are certain drugs that are moralized over others. I think the more legal or socially acceptable a substance is, the more moralized it is. And I think if we're being very honest and candid, that means alcohol, because it's the longest standing socially acceptable legal substance probably across the world. And if you think of it from that perspective, here's how much this is different. If I think of it from that perspective and I recognize, okay, alcohol is kind of moralized and socially acceptable, people are okay with alcohol within moderation, we have defined those so differently. I'm big on words.
Yeah, I know. We've defined moderation differently too, right? So,
oh yeah, I've had people come in and say the following phrase: "Well, I just have a little bit," and I usually have to follow that up with, "Well, what does that mean?"
Right.
Because
a glass of wine.
Yeah,
you do realize a whole bottle can fit in the glasses of wine that we have today.
Yeah, you realize that a glass of wine by actual standards is half of the glass. Yeah. It's not to the brim.
Yeah.
Or people are like, well, a glass glass of wine once a week versus, I only had a fifth today.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big variation. Right, alcohol's this kind of particular, its own category because of the nature that it's played in society for so long. I'm big on words. I have a communications background. I've always found that really helpful in therapy to separate concepts with different phrases if we can, just to kind of be able to pair and draw lines instead of allowing things to kind of get blurry.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever thought of what getting blackout drunk actually is?
Mm-hmm.
It's overdosing.
Yep.
But we will never call it that.
Right.
It's because that takes the glorification and the fun out of that concept.
Mm-hmm.
Because nobody likes to walk around and go, oh man, I got wicked overdosed on alcohol yesterday.
Right. It's like I got wasted.
Right. I got wasted. I got blackout drunk, or whatever phrase that is. And for me, if we look at that systemically, the reason we do that is because it doesn't sound as, going back to that sin concept, it doesn't sound as awful, as sinful to say I did this over that.
Mm-hmm.
Heck, if you think of most substance use treatment programs and centers, it's drugs and alcohol. Alcohol is always separated out as if it's this own special classification that's not quite a drug. Alcohol's a drug. In fact, it's a pretty volatile drug in some regards. It's pretty dangerous, and if you ask most professionals I've talked to, is that alcohol is actually one of the most lethal substances in withdrawals.
Yeah.
If you want to come off of heavy drinking or heavy substance use, alcohol is one of your biggest, riskiest ones.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it doesn't take much to kind of get in this spot where if you're having a bad day or a bad week or a bad month or even your year.
Yeah.
Sorry. Anyway, got to finish it. Then the reality is that you can have a glass of whiskey and all of a sudden your inhibitions and the things you won't say, it's not like you've done meth. It's not like you've done crack or heroin. It's not like you're on some huge high. But man, the amount of fights and babies and car wrecks and everything else had by just a little bit of alcohol is statistically really high.
Yeah, it's the WD-40 on our frontal lobe.
I like that.
It's just greasing things over because education standpoint, I teach everybody that I've ever worked with substance use. The first part of your brain impacted by any substance, as far as I remember, is your frontal lobe. And that is 3 important functions. It is your risk assessor, your emotional manager, and your forward planner. And then when you start breaking that down, the number of revelations I see on people's faces, they're like, oh, well, that makes sense. I didn't think about the consequences of what happened if I kept using X, Y, or Z. I didn't think about how this could impact me tomorrow if I drive home intoxicated today. Or I would never say those things sober, but now I'm saying it under the influence. And that's another myth I like to break is, alcohol and other drugs are not liquid truth. They're raw emotions. That's what's coming out. It's unfiltered, uncut footage. When people listen to this, it still has some editing done to it so that I sound more like a professional. But the reality is like that's not 100% you. Just as much as saying, if you met me on the worst day of my life, let's go back to that story I said at the start of this, is if you met 11-year-old me on the day that I experienced that tragedy, and you said, that's Cole every day of his life, would you call it fair?
Right,
would you call it, would it make sense? No. It's an extreme circumstance. And so when we think of that, I think that's important to realize as we see the human behind an addiction is that's not just them. That's maybe a part of them. That's an aspect of them. But it's them when they're in a dysfunction, when they're unhealthy, when they're ill.
Yep.
And that doesn't represent who someone is at their core all the time when they're sick. Yeah. Just as much as if I get the flu, I'm not going to behave like I do when I'm in my peak physical health.
Well, and just because you have a thought or a feeling that comes to your mind doesn't mean you actually believe that thing.
Right.
So if you have a thought about your wife or your kids or your husband and you're drinking, and then you say that thing,
Right.
people say, oh, well, then what it revealed was what you really think. And it's like, that's not always true. It could have.
Sure.
But it could have just been something that you didn't have a filter for, that you hadn't processed and that you hadn't thought through, and that is a fear.
Yeah, what I really thought, and then would have automatically corrected with a healthy, sober brain.
Right.
Because that's not a healthy, sober thought.
Right.
And I think that's a big part of addiction, too, is just recognizing that it can make you like a different person. You're still in there. You're still making choices. And those choices and those decisions are going to be different because the brain responsible for part of your brain responsible for doing that isn't working correctly.
Mm-hmm.
I would always hear the term, it's hijacked.
Yep.
Yeah, you're still there when you get hijacked, but you don't have control the way you do when you're not hijacked.
You can grab the steering wheel and maybe wreck the car, but you're not going to get much driving done.
Yeah, you're probably not driving smooth.
That's right.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's good. So, all right, that's a good definition. So what do you think, in the realm of like addiction, what do you think some of the biggest myths are that people, like the average person listen to this, doesn't know?
Mm-hmm. So average myths, like things that tend not to be true, or myths that will surprise
Whatever
someone?
comes to your mind. I mean, you work with this a lot, and I know for me, like, it's like trauma.
Mm-hmm.
It's like things that semi annoy me, or I wish people knew, like just what comes to your head when you think about addiction in general, or things that like like when you have clients come in, that's the thing you always have to teach, that you're like, I can't believe nobody knows this.
Yeah.
Now I'm 20 years into this and people still don't know it.
Yeah, I think two of them we've already addressed.
Right.
One's the liquid courage, the this is who you really are concept. And the other one's kind of that idea that of how that impacts the frontal lobe and what that looks like. I think the other one I hear really often, or that I talk to people about a lot, is just the reality of how challenging recovery is and what people need in recovery.
Mm-hmm.
When you think of recovery, one of the big catchphrases I got a long time ago that has always stuck with me is addiction is a lifestyle. It is a series of choices, values, behaviors that we get invested in. And it's going to require a lifestyle change to get out of it.
That's right.
And that's why I like calling it, there's addiction and then there's recovery from addiction. And when you think of it that way, let's take, for example, any kind of change from a behavioral mindset. The most common one that always comes to mind for me is the New Year's resolution. What's everyone's New Year's resolution?
That's right.
I'm going to lose weight. I'm going
Right.
to eat healthy, whatever that is. Poorly defined.
But they get a gym membership.
Right, and they get a gym membership. Right. So they do that. And some people have more willpower than others. Some people are a little bit more motivated than others. And they can kick that for like 30 days, 45 days. Maybe they make it all the way to April. And they usually fall off at some point. The statistical average is that most people don't stick with their New Year's resolutions more than a handful of months, maybe. So here's this thing we all know is better for us: eating healthier, exercising on a regular basis. Nobody's sitting there going, wait, what? If I eat healthy and exercise, I'm going to be healthier?
I should drink more water.
Right? No one's surprised by this.
Uh-huh.
And yet...
And nobody would argue it.
Right.
Yeah.
And yet, not a whole lot of people look at somebody who quits on their New Year's resolution and goes, you deplorable monster, you stopped exercising. Do you know what this does to your friends and family? Nobody says that. They're like, me too.
Right.
Clap hands. But that's what happens to people in addiction, is they make a mistake. They make a poor choice. They go out and they have a beverage, or they get tempted and they fall short, and people rake them over the coals. And I know why. I'm not going to belabor that and say it doesn't happen for some kind of purpose. There's a lot of impact, immediate, visceral consequences. And if we're truly trying to support someone who is trying to go through recovery, mistakes are bound to happen because we're people. And I think that's one big thing I've addressed with every single person I've worked with that addresses addiction issues is you are still a person. You are still going to make mistakes. And if you don't, that's just a blessing. And if you do, the important thing is to differentiate what I call that difference between guilt and shame. I think oftentimes in today's world, those two things are smashed together like they're the same thing. And for me, they couldn't be more separate. From a spiritual context, guilt is what we're called to do. God says, atone for your sins, ask for repentance and forgiveness, and I shall give it. Move forward and learn from it. That's guilt. Guilt doesn't feel good. It feels bad. And then because we've fallen short of a standard we accept we're capable of, that's guilt. Shame is now an identity spoiler. It says the reason I do negative XYZ is because I'm broken, I'm faulty, I'm sick, and I can't be better.
Yep.
Shame's sticky.
Yep.
And so oftentimes when we get shamed, we don't progress.
That's good.
Because we don't believe we're capable of more.
Yeah.
It's the person who's struggling with an addiction that says, well, I can't be better because the other people in my life are telling me that I'm an addict instead of a person with an addiction. And so if I'm an addict, what do addicts do? They be addicting. That's what happens. Whereas opposed to a guilt statement is going to say, I am a person that struggles with this thing, and I know I'm capable of doing better, or I believe I'm capable of doing better. Here's where I messed up. How can I learn from that? How can I get back up, brush the dirt off, and move forward with my recovery? And I think that's a really powerful lesson I've seen happen, because it's not just addiction work at that point. It's shame work too.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the gospel.
Yeah.
What you're saying is it's that old people talk about grace and mercy and God's forgiveness, and then people are like, well, don't forget you're a sinner saved by grace. And it's we do a really bad job, I think, in parenting, of kids come out the gate and we're like, you little sinner, you're bad, all of this is your sin, and you need to take care of that, and you need to work that out, and you need Jesus to save you from your sin, and like we just have a heavy focus on that. And that's true, right? We are sinners saved by grace.
Right.
But Jesus made it to where God sees us how we will eventually be. So in God's eyes, we're no longer sinners. We're sons. We're no longer slaves, but we're adopted. So in God's eyes, we've shifted. So it's interesting that as Christians, who are supposed to be little Christ, who are supposed to be the ambassadors, the reconcilers, the redeemers for him, since he's left us the Holy Spirit, we need to see other people that way. We need to see their behaviors not as who they are, but as a thing they're struggling with, and their sin not as who they are, but something that they're struggling with. And I think, if we can surround people, it evens everything out, because then addiction is just another, label for sin.
Yeah.
And yes, I think this, in the nuance of that, is it your sin? Is it sin in the world? I mean, a baby who's born, addicted to crack cocaine because the mom and the dad did crack cocaine,
right?
That's sin, right? But it's not sinful of the human,
right?
It's capable. It's capable. It's possible that baby's born addicted to crack because of sin in the world, because of a broken system, because of epigenetics and generational sin.
Yeah.
But God's not looking at that kid going, you did something morally wrong, and that's why you did it. And so I think where counseling comes in and community comes in is we have to learn to identify through our relationships, is this an addiction that I'm responsible for, that I need to change things and do and put some barriers in place and boundaries in place and recovery?
Yeah.
Or is this something that's chemistry and not character?
Right.
That I may still have to do all those boundary things, but isn't something that I'm failing at or doing wrong.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that's a good jumping off point as you ask about myths or things that I commonly address, is you pull up the age-old argument of nature versus nurture. And why not both? Why not both?
Well, it is both.
Because I know plenty of people that come from families where they have generational addictions after addictions, and they're the most sober-focused, recovery-focused people I've ever met in my life. And then you see people who come from absolutely no addiction in their background, and they have fallen down into the dregs with it. And so, right there says genetics can only be a part of this. Nurture can only be a part of this, because there's always choice involved in there. Now, sometimes those choices are harder than others, and choice is always involved.
Mm-hmm.
Someone told me one time with the disease model concept of addiction, they said, I want you to think of it like any disease that happens because of a series of choices you've made, but then once you've had it, it's not curable.
Mm-hmm.
That's what addiction is. It's not that it starts and you're both physically and psychologically from the get-go. It's we have choices that we make in those regards. And those take us to a place where once we have that disease, there are people that manage diseases well, and there are people that don't.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've ever met someone with a significant disease that manages it well, you'd never know.
Do you think, so here's the question around choice, because I do think that a lot of people who don't struggle with addiction, I don't know. Do those people exist? That's
people that don't struggle with addiction?
Yeah.
I think if we go based off of my kind of hardcore definition, yeah, probably.
Okay.
I mean, I imagine there are some people in the world that don't struggle with addiction.
Yeah. But it's pretty few and far between.
Yeah, I
right?
think
Would
it's
you
a lot
say?
less common than people like to believe it is. I think a lot of people struggle with their own, if we take that DSM definition, I think a lot more people than they believe struggle with mild addiction.
Mm-hmm. That's what I mean, like shopping, eating, drinking, working, exercise.
Yeah, all these healthy things that we make dysfunctional when we give them inappropriate space in our life. If we think of addiction as it's starting to get dysfunctional, it's when we start doing these things that are dysfunctional with this. But
it's working for me, Cole. What are you talking about?
Yeah, but it feels good. I have very rarely, if ever, met someone with a true addiction that goes, oh, I parsed this out to these appropriate degrees based off all of this research, foreknowledge, and background.
Mm-hmm.
It's usually how
and to ask my friends and my family, and I made
to
sure
take
it
all
didn't
their counsel.
I made sure it didn't negatively impact them.
Right.
Because that's the other problem I think we forget about with addiction and all of these things is that, and shopping and buying and anything, right? Yeah. Is that we are in a system, we're in a family, we're in a body of Christ. And so the idea that we can just do things, drink things, eat things without thinking about the impact they make on us and others is, one, unbiblical, and two, just mindless.
It's just not true.
Yeah. And so when we look at the scripture and the Bible's perspective on our bodies they're not our own.
Right.
Like they're God's.
Mm-hmm.
It's not my body. So I have to ask God. I have to check in with him, and then I have to check in with the rest of the body and go, hey, how is this thing doing? And I think that's where we can figure out, is this mild, moderate, or severe addiction?
Yeah, and if you have people checking in, even from a secular approach, is you don't exist independently. Mm-hmm. You just don't. No matter how many times someone's wanted to come up to me and been like, no, I'm an independent person. I'm a self-made whatever. I'm like, no, you're not.
It's just an American view.
How many stitches on your clothing today did you hand do?
That's right.
Oh, 0? Yeah. You're not independent. You're dependent on the person that made your clothes. And unless you killed every chicken, hog, and cow and grew every vegetable in that grocery store, you're dependent.
Mm-hmm.
We're all dependent. That's society. And from a faith background, it's called the body of Christ, not the single cell of Christ.
That's right.
And we were all created to be different. It's not the 1,000 fingers of Christ. That'd be creepy.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we're absolutely, I would agree with that. We're dependent. We need community. I had a pastor one time, I really like this, said the justification for fellowship and community in the Bible is found in Genesis.
Oh, yeah.
And everybody's like, whoa, wait, what? He goes, yeah, it's found in Genesis. The only time, if you believe God is a perfect, omnipotent God, the only time a perfect, omnipotent God didn't say what he did was good was when he made Adam. He waited until he made Eve.
Mm-hmm.
He waited until Adam had community before he said, and it is good. Every other day, it's right after he's done.
Right.
He's like, seas, I'm good. Earth, I'm good. Light, animals, good, good, good. Adam, pause. Eve, I'm good.
He actually said it's not good for you to be alone.
Right, there you go.
Which is the other weird part, is that he's with God.
Mm-hmm.
Like Adam's with God.
Yeah.
And yet God's saying, you're alone right now.
Mm-hmm.
That's the mind-blowing part, is that you're right. Like, it's in that relationship, that community, that we image God the best.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, when it comes to addiction, when we look at it as this person over here has an addiction that has nothing to do with me,
Mm-hmm.
that I have done nothing to, and no one else has. It's just a individual choice they made, and if they would have made better choices, they wouldn't be, it's just not true.
Right.
And when you get into recovery, right, you know this, but like what brings the healing is when the people around that person can realize like, oh, I might have played some responsibility into this, or maybe I didn't particularly, but someone did.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not all this person's fault.
Yeah.
And that's what I was going to ask. Like, you talk about choice. How many addicts do you think are people that struggle with addiction that it starts in adulthood versus childhood?
Oh, I don't know. That's a really hard question to ask because I've met a lot of both.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think the story that still kind of gets me a little is remembering that I had somebody so I used to do the inpatient substance use treatment evaluations to get people into rehabs. And I had an individual in their early 30s come in and told me, we were trained if they say a number of age of first use below 10, you're probably going to disregard it.
Mm-hmm.
So ask questions or round up. Like, okay, whatever. So I have this young individual come in and they say 6. I'm like, okay, you accidentally had a sip off of mom or dad's alcoholic beverage. I hear you. And they're like, no, I started drinking at 6 years old.
Mm-hmm.
I had a mom who had a severe alcohol issue and didn't want to drink alone. So she had me and my younger sibling drinking with her.
Mm-hmm.
And because mom was the only parent in the household and their kids, they drank.
Yeah.
So we have stories like that.
Yeah, it's more common than people think.
Right.
I mean, there was recently in the last year, a video on Instagram of a mom. She's smoking a joint, and she's like letting the 7-year-old
Mm-hmm.
and the 3-year-old smoke the joint live on Instagram.
Yeah.
It's common for addicts, full-blown addicts, to be in a state of such disarray that, they not only are they just addicted, but then there's all the other systemic problems that are going into it.
There's that nature and that nurture.
Mm-hmm.
Is, okay, your direct parent has a substance use problem, and you're constantly being exposed to that as a byproduct.
And, guys, people who do those sorts of things are doing horrible things and need consequences.
Yeah.
They need accountability. They need to be, caught and taken care of, and yet both are true. That
Right.
once you stop the damage, punishing that person and making them feel worse about themselves is not going to help them get done with that
You're
drug.
probably going to lead them back to doing it again.
Exactly.
It'll be their second Instagram video.
Yeah, exactly.
And
They'll move to Twitch or Snapchat.
Sure. And so, right, they need that love and that support in those regards. And so when I talk about choice, I think you're putting it really well, is that concept of you will always have a decision to make, because until someone is physically forcing something on you, it's always your choice.
Well, so that's my point of kids, is that when
kids are a different category because
but I'm saying
Yeah.
we don't look at the adults that are in our office who
Yeah.
are 30
right.
or 40
and
or
go,
60.
oh, their first use was 7 years old.
Yes, like
Yeah.
that wasn't a choice.
Right.
They actively made a choice as a child, but is that really a choice when you're a child? And that becomes
Right.
the point of empathy, of going, okay, if addiction is a pattern of behaviors that happen over, if your neurology has changed, if it's not the same choice as white or wheat bread, but like a neurological deficit that limits your ability to actually choose until you get buffers and all the things we know, then when did it become a choice, and when can it become a choice again?
Right.
And that's something I think that we need to people listening need to understand, is that if you have somebody in your life who is an addict, or you look at addiction as something that is just horrible, most people don't start off, having a perfect life and a low ACE score,
Right.
0 trauma, and then at 42 they're like, I think I'm going to start getting super drunk every day.
It sounds great. I'm going to hop into a big old thing of fentanyl today.
Right.
That doesn't happen. And they're not things that exist in vacuums. Like most of our problems aren't.
Mm-hmm.
They don't just exist in a vacuum. Environment and people and our spirit and our decisions.
Well, we all contribute to it.
Right. Choice is a component of addiction. I think the important part of choice is in recognizing the power that it holds and the responsibility we carry with it.
Mm-hmm.
In addiction, it's that power in saying, I, as an adult, and to a smaller degree because of brain chemistry and development, in adolescence maybe. I think as a small child, it gets really difficult just from the psychology of it. Is, like you're saying, how well does a child truly make those decisions? But as we get older and we reach that point, because I predominantly work with adults, FYI, for everybody on here, and, we've reached that point where we have some decision-making power, and one of my favorite things to work with people on is in recognizing the importance of saying, this is my choice. Mm-hmm. Because here's the double-edged sword nature of that is, if it is my choice, that means I do have some say-so, some power, some control over my circumstance. Yeah. Instead of that idea where I say things like, well, if so-and-so hadn't done this, I wouldn't be using right now.
Right.
If, this catastrophe hadn't happened in my life, I wouldn't be drinking right now. Those excuses surrender our power over our addictions, over our choices to something or someone else. Mm-hmm. And on the flip side, though, that comes with responsibility, is that if that's true, I can't then just push responsibility off to the next person when it's inconvenient. Mm-hmm. I can't have my cake and eat it too.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I think that's part of the recovery work, though, is when there is truth to someone else did this to me, mm-hmm. someone else is responsible or holds some level of responsibility, is sitting with people and empathizing with them that is true actually allows them to move from victim to personal responsibility. Because at one point it was true.
Yeah.
And you need to be empathized with and validated. Right. And then you won't need the validation. Mm-hmm. Right? Then if somebody sits with you and it's sexual abuse or addiction or any other kind of trauma that you've been exposed to, and someone sits with you and goes, hey, you're right. Mm-hmm. You did not deserve this. This should not have happened. Yeah. This is not what God intended for you. This is no longer your responsibility. It's unburden that. And you're able to do that. Now moving forward, the excuse of, well, my dad was whatever, and that's why I keep drinking because I'm just in so much pain still.
It's the keep part.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I appreciate that you said that about, the differences between adult and kids. I get caught up in the adult world.
No, that's okay.
Absolutely I agree with the idea that when we're kids, we just don't have that kind of decision-making power. You don't have control over your parents. You don't get to choose how you were raised. You don't get to choose your environment. It's just not how it works. Mm-hmm. And I like to call it the tightrope walk, is you're walking this tightrope, and the weight on one side trying to hold you on this tightrope is your past, the things you probably didn't have control over, your parents, your family, your environment, etc., how you were raised. But on the other side of that tightrope, you have you now if you're an adult. You have that part where it says, okay, now I know where this is coming from. Mm-hmm. I've identified this. Somebody's empathized with me in this regard. I have support on what this feels like and what my experiences were. So I can't, it's going from what I like to call excuses to reasons. Mm-hmm. Excuses will excuse my behavior. It'll make me sound blameless, faultless, like I had no say-so. Mm-hmm.
Which for those early decisions,
protecting. Right.
And for those early decisions, that inner child needs you to protect it.
Right. Reasons take responsibility.
Yep, that's good.
They say, hey, I am at fault when I am now a 30-something-year-old adult, and I've done the work on where this came from, and I still choose to do whatever it is, alcohol, meth, weed. When I make that decision today, if I'm offering an excuse, I'm saying, but mom, dad, uncle, aunt, whatever, so I'm faultless. Whereas a reason's going to say, those are things that still impact me today, and I had a decision to make. Both of those things are true.
Absolutely. And the decisions came away before you walked in the bar and opened the bottle. That's the other part, right? So if you don't have the resources and the tools or the conception of why you keep walking into the bar and getting the bottle, that means you do have limited choice.
Yeah. Biggest, most helpful thing I got to learn in that regard is that dopamine process that happens when we use substances starts when you get triggered. Mm-hmm. So a little education for those listening. The trigger cycle is a trigger hits a thought, which hits a craving, which hits use. And so the dopamine, the pleasure-seeking chemical in your brain, starts going off when you get triggered. You smell something, you taste something, a memory pops up for you, a stressor happens, whatever that triggering sensation for your addiction is.
You feel shame. You feel not good enough.
Yeah. When all of that starts happening, you start getting your little dopamine drops. Bloop, bloop, bloop. And then once that happens, you hit that thought. And if it's unproductive, that thought's going to glorify whatever your addiction is. It's going to say, oh, remember that time where I used XYZ and it felt so good.
Which is what we call euphoric recall.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're getting high off of the memory and the thinking.
Literally.
Yes.
Because dopamine's going a little bit faster now. And when I was working with a lot of substance use, it would keep going. It'd turn into remember that party, remember that time. And then I'm putting on my using jams and I'm putting on my whatever hoodie, my smoking jacket, and I'm getting in the car and I'm going down these streets and I'm seeing these other things. And it starts building and building and building. And it's like a snowball rolling down a mountain. And if we don't cut it early, it's going to get too big for us to stop it. And that's what cravings start to feel like. That's when if you think of it going back to our example of food, I usually tell people it's like craving anything. It's like if I really want pizza this afternoon, the trigger is my stomach growls. I'm hungry. And so the thought is, ooh, I think they have a deal at Johnny's for me to get whatever large pizza.
Pepperoni power.
And go for that. Oh, I love that chicken bacon. A chicken ranchero, that's what it is. And so, that's the start. And then it's the thought, and you're thinking about how good that would taste, and then your mouth starts to salivate as you're really digging into your cravings, which are, when am I going to get it? How am I going to get it? How much is it going to cost? What am I going to do to have to make this happen? And how much am I going to enjoy it when it happens? And then
should I lie or not lie to my wife about getting this pizza?
How do I hide it?
Yeah.
Which card can I use so that she won't figure it out or won't figure it out quickly?
Which is interesting because as you're talking about it, it's like some of that is like what we all do about everything.
Right.
And so it's like, when is that addiction and when it's not, which we covered earlier.
Yeah.
And I think that the reality is that that's why Christ tells us to hold every thought captive. That it isn't living the Christian life, following Jesus, whether full-blown addiction or moderate or mild or whatever impulsivity is before even mild addiction.
Right.
All fall short.
Yeah.
And so it's important to know these things and label these things, because it does mean how much support am I going to need? How much help am I going to need? How many resources am I going to need to be able to defeat this thing?
Yeah. How big's my problem?
Yes, exactly. How big's the boulder that's about to roll down the hill, But on a personal level, the idea that some people are morally superior to others because they don't have that, I think, is what feeds this whole culture around like getting people help.
The idea that addiction is a moral problem is more likely to keep someone in addiction than help them recover from it. That's been my experience. That doesn't make me right. Like I said, I'm 31 years old. I've been doing this as a professional therapist for nearly a decade. In the grand scheme of things, it's a small amount of experience. And I can tell you, I've probably seen close to 1,000 people, and I have not seen someone go, thinking of this as my moral dilemma helped me so much.
Not in the beginning, anyway.
Yeah. Recognizing that there are moral dilemma aspects to it, and recognizing where I do and don't have decisions over that, absolutely helpful. But thinking of this as strictly and only a moral failing, I rarely see that benefit someone in the long term.
Yep.
Recognizing where I have moral failings is helpful. Calling something only this. I think that's what we do with a lot of problems in our life, whether it's trauma or addiction or things with our physical health. Is I think as human beings, we like to understand, and it's easier to understand a single concept than a convoluted web. And so we like to pin something to the board. And more times than not, I think things, especially like addiction, are those complex spiderweb things you see in, a CSI show. You see all the red yarn that goes to the 30 different points. And that's most of our problems and our addictions. It's not this is the answer. It's this is a factor in the answer. When you think of your trauma, this is a factor in the answer. It may be a bigger factor than the other one, bigger piece of that pie or that pizza as we were talking about it. But it's probably part of a problem. And when we try to pin something to the board and single something out and say that's the solution, here's the trick, is that if we do that and then we solve it and we solve the problem, then what? When we see it as a bigger picture, when we see someone as a person with an addiction as opposed to, they're an addict. When you see someone as somebody with trauma, with post-traumatic stress disorder, instead of that's that PTSD person, there's that bipolar, that borderline personality disorder, that OCD. When we see people as those are aspects of who they are, we have a better opportunity, in my experiences, to be able to more effectively navigate those things, because we recognize these are factors, which means I'm going to have to put effort into multiple different places. That's why I like the concept of addiction as a lifestyle. In every inpatient, as far as I'm aware of, you're going to hear change your people, places, and things, and that's done for a reason. It's not just because it's catchy. It's because it's an emphasis that addiction is a lifestyle choice. And if we don't change a significant amount of our lifestyle, you're going to fall back into it as the most likely outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And that takes a lot of courage.
Yeah.
People that are addicts, people who are struggling, listen to this. Like, it takes a lot of courage to come forward and be vulnerable and say, I need help. I'm out of control. And then it takes a lot of courage to stay with it, and even more courage to radically change your whole life. But that's what it takes. And that's what Christ calls us to, is when we see an area of our life that's been idolized and devoted to darkness, we have to radically change everything about us. We can't play with that. We can't think that, I'll stay in the same job or the same career field or around the same friends or go to the same places or even the same house sometimes without radically changing all of those things.
We are transformed.
Yeah.
And that's the big difference there. Is I've had a lot of people tell me, I'm sober. And I'm like, that's just an absence of a dangerous substance in your system. Are you in recovery? And I think if I'm being big on words, the other one that I hear a lot is I'm doing what I'm supposed to. And I go,
the next right thing.
You want to know what I refer to as doing what I'm supposed to? When I do the dishes, when I take out the trash, I don't skip merrily to the sink. I don't shout worship and joy as I take the stinky garbage out to the trash can. Those are obligations. If I want something to be impactful and meaningful, I have to desire it. It's going to change me. And I think in those regards too, that's how people get from addictions to recovery, is that you can't just do what you're supposed to, because that's carrot or stick. And eventually that's going to run out. One thing that's always stuck with me that you said in a staffing a while ago that I still use today, and it'll probably stick with me for the rest of my life, it's one of those things, is you said belief has to change first. Actions and emotions are probably going to follow that. And I think that's addictions too, is the belief that I'm nothing but an addict, that I have to be stuck here, that mom or dad and grandma and grandpa, they were all like this, and every significant friend in my life is like this, so I'm stuck, has to be at least willing to be challenged and changed before those actions and those words and those emotions are going to follow consistently. Now, I can watch people white knuckle it for a year or something like that. I think anybody with significant willpower, I'm doing air quotes for those at home, can navigate that for a while. But if you want real change, it's not about just doing that behavior change. It's about switching that belief system. It's about saying, I am no longer this because I was transformed, and so now I am this.
Yeah, and I think to add on to that, thank you for that quote. To add on to that, I don't know where I heard that. I'm sure I stole it from somebody else. I'm not that smart.
Put it in your memoirs.
That's right. The documentary. So to somebody has to believe it, though.
Yeah.
So when I say, like, you have to believe it, I do think faith, once you become a believer, I think the change that happens in you is God causes it.
Yeah.
Right? So to change a belief, we can't change our beliefs. The Holy Spirit changes our beliefs for us by us having an encounter with him.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we encounter him?
Right.
We pray.
Yeah.
We are in relationship with other people who have the Holy Spirit in them.
Ding, ding.
Right? So we hold belief. I tell clients all the time, I'm going to hold belief for you until you believe it.
Mm-hmm.
So then we actively live a way that is enticing, is an aroma, is proving to them through our actions and our energy and who we are at the cell level that we believe that they're worthy and they're valuable and they're loved and they're enough and they're all because of what Christ has done. As you live that out, there is something mysterious and supernatural that happens to where the other person starts to believe it.
Yeah.
And then they start to change.
It's a process and a promise, and those things require effort over time.
Yep. And when you believe it, so then when you believe it, this is what I was going to add to, like for me, I don't always feel like taking the trash out, right? I don't always feel like being sober. I don't always feel like doing the right thing. I don't always feel like playing another game of Uno with my kids at 7:30 when it's time for them to go to bed and they treated me like trash for 2 hours, right?
Yeah.
Like we don't always feel like it. But faith is, after we have the initial salvation, faith is doing things that we don't always believe in the moment or we don't always feel in the moment.
Right.
Trusting because we believe that God is just and he is good and he makes it possible. So it does come back to our beliefs shape our thoughts and feelings, which shape our actions. But sometimes, lots of times, most of the time, we have to do things that we know are good and right and true.
Yeah.
Even though we don't feel them.
Yeah.
And even though we might not in the moment believe that it's going to be a good outcome.
Mm-hmm.
But the act of doing them is an act of belief and faith.
Yeah.
So it's like I'm gonna believe. Not just I believe, but I'm going to believe that by doing this, by loving my enemy and praying for those that persecute me, I don't want to do that.
Right.
That's irrational.
Yeah.
It goes against everything that I know.
It doesn't feel good.
No, and yet I'm gonna act as a human being by the power of the Spirit to believe that by doing this, there's going to be some outcome that glorifies God.
Yeah.
And that it may or may not be immediately beneficial for me.
Mm-hmm.
It will overall be beneficial for me because God says it will.
Right.
But I may not ever see that or understand that
Yeah.
this side of restoration.
That's faith and trust.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there was a really cool thing. So I was trained in a style of therapy called motivational interviewing, and it's considered one of those therapies that's pretty well portable for addictions work. And one of the things that I always liked in motivational interviewing is it talks about that concept that you're kind of talking about, that idea of you're building the motivation towards this difference, this change, this radical change in your life, and that motivation waxes and wanes over time. There are definitely going to be times when you're not motivated to do the thing. And if you set yourself up for success, you're more likely to pull through. For Christians, that's faith. That's a big component of your motivation. It's believing that if I do this thing, even though it doesn't feel good and it goes against my natural impulses, that it's going to turn out for the betterment of mind, body, and soul, and it's going to glorify God. And that if I can do that thing, that's going to build my motivation because I need those motivation builders.
Right.
I need that thing. Because if I don't have it consistently, I won't follow through for very long. That goes back to that white knuckling concept, is you can only do it for so long. I've met people with incredible willpower, as it's usually called. And the reality is you're human, so it wanes. You have bad days, you have bad experiences, you have rough times, you lack sleep, you get hungry, you get angry, you get lonely. And in those moments when you're at your weakest, you will falter. We can't rely on that alone. It's not enough. We are not enough in that regard.
That's good, man.
And so we need those other things. For the person who's struggling with an addiction, that's faith, that's community, that's support, that's good coping skills, that's awareness, that's maybe trauma work, maybe some mental health diagnoses that you didn't know you had that you need to address. It's multifactorial. It's the spider web. And for other people, those factors are going to play into your lives as well. Is there's going to be those things that you need. it would be so wonderful if it was so simple that I could pin it to the board. The reality is it's usually D, all the above.
Yep. It's good, man. Any closing thoughts, comments? Man, we covered a ton.
Yeah.
I thought that was fantastic.
No, I think that just in closing, again, I really can't encourage enough to remember that your loved ones, or if you're struggling with an addiction today, that from a faith perspective, you're still a child of God. Mm-hmm. You still deserve to be loved. And that even though you've fallen into sin or sinful choices or sinful behaviors, that doesn't mean you have to stay there. It doesn't mean it's easy to get out of it. There's a big difference between something being easy and simple. Mm-hmm. Getting out of addiction can be rather simple. That doesn't mean it's easy.
Right.
It's simple, the concept of bench pressing a vehicle. You get under it and apply force. Now go outside and try to lift your car.
Right.
Not going to happen. Now, I'm not saying that getting out of addiction is impossible, like bench pressing a car probably is. But keeping in mind that getting out of addiction is possible. And even that right there, that's the start of a belief change. And that your belief is going to be challenged. Just like for all of us who identify with that Christian faith, is your belief will be challenged by this world, by the tragedies that you fall into, or that come your way, or that you invited in, by life and its circumstances, by job and relationship. You will be challenged, and iron sharpens iron. We need that challenge to grow. Growth happens in discomfort. Mm-hmm. It doesn't happen when we're complacent and comfortable. And change equals growth. So if I want to grow, if I want to be better, if that's what I'm called to be, I'm going to get uncomfortable.
Yep.
That's a part of it. And so I need that. Whether my feelings say I want that or not, I need that. It needs to happen. And so in those regards, we're going to be challenged. And the likelihood, because we're human, is we're going to make a mistake. The biggest, most beneficial thing I've seen people do for long-term, helpful, healthy recovery isn't setting perfect standards or having set goals that demonstrate perfection or getting it just right. It's the individuals that recognized that if they're going to make a mistake, that is part of their journey. Mm-hmm. My favorite Bible verse, I believe, is Psalm 23. We are promised the valley of the shadow of death. We aren't promised that God's going to fly us around it or dig us a tunnel under it or walk us along the mountain of good times. We're promised that he's there with us, and that's what gives us comfort. So if you're there today and you're challenged by an addiction or a family member's addiction, because that impacts you too, is remember that you aren't alone. Mm-hmm. And that's an important healing part of dealing with any of life's problems, is to know that you're not by yourself and that it's possible to believe in something different.
That's good, man. Good word. I got nothing to say to that. Guys, Cole Westoff, ladies and gentlemen, addiction specialist, LPC, D&D extraordinaire, the best DM in the world. We both nerd out about Dungeons and Dragons all the time. Oh, yeah. We've had some Clint Davis counseling one-shots, so we got to get one in before you go.
Yeah, we'll do it in this podcast room.
I know, we can. We could do a podcast.
We could start do a D&D. Actual play.
I know. We could do a one-shot on here and just like do a therapy version.
We'll take off.
Exactly. Thanks, man. That was great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Always good to talk to you. Guys, Cole's information will be on our website. If he's somebody you'd like to talk to, he's going to be doing telehealth. If you're in Missouri,
I'll see you in person potentially if you're in Missouri, depending on what part. I'll be in Southwest Missouri, and if you're in Louisiana, I still have my Louisiana state license, and so I can provide telehealth to anybody anywhere in Louisiana, technically.
Yep, he'll be still with us with Clint Davis Counseling through telehealth, and we're going to help him get launched over there in Missouri, and God's going to do the rest of it. So thanks, man. Thank you guys for listening. God bless you. If you need help with addiction, give us a call, give us an email, shoot us a message on Instagram or Facebook or wherever you see this stuff, and we'd love to help you connect in your area, connect you to a therapist. I'm sure Cole would love to meet with you and guide you if you need something. God bless you and have a good week.